is associated with public safety needs to be at the table to grab those ideas and to move these things forward so that law enforcement agencies can get back to the business of protecting and serving. And I think that you are starting to see now the frustration on behalf of law enforcement with officers, not wanting to come to work and all those other things. So the frustration now has reached a point where you've got to have some strong leadership to reel everyone in and start doing what needs to be done to make those meaningful reforms and not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
That's hard to do. That's hard to do. You don't get rid of the police force altogether, but it's got to be different. Hence the defund the police cries, which is essentially saying not abolish the police, but redirect money that would ordinarily go to the police or public safety and direct it towards some of those other areas. Direct that money to psychiatric testing for some of these officers.
You raise a great point, Sinbad. And one of the things that I've advocated for years is that, as law enforcement folks, whether it's DEA, FBI, whatever the acronym is, as they make those, as they have these operations, you need to start looking at having those other agencies that are impacted. They need to be staffed up too. For example, the corrections, parole, and probation people, they need to be staffed up so that they can help these offenders who are locked up and coming out into society or coming in. The social services folk, I guarantee you, if you were to look at the backgrounds of a majority of the people, black and white and green and whatever, who've been arrested, you will find a large majority of them are coming from some systemic things that they need help with. Mm-hmm. And so when you've got let's just say you've got in Butte, Montana, half the jail is full, but yet they're lagging in behavioral scientists and social scientists and so forth to kind of give these men and women some support and some evaluation and all the other things. No wonder the system is so clogged up and messed up.
Right. And there's a question now: how much of a police budget, a department's budget, how much of a department, about ballpark, is set up for training with regard to tactical training, marksmanship, combat, and all of that stuff, as opposed to behavioral or behavioral training or testing or psychological something, or diversity or sensitivity training. Is it that simple? Is it cut up that way, or who determines how much goes to where? Because they seem to be shooting pretty good, so they got that down. But can we get to the choking? They got that down. They don't need another damn lesson on choking. So
right.
But and how hard is it to get the? Well, I guess if they, down on some of the municipalities, the mayors, start putting. As I did mention, if you slap a 10-year sentence on somebody, I think it was Ryan last week. Ryan was talking about if you put 10 years on an unjustified killing, that might cause an officer to rethink what they're doing. When they pull that, before they pull that gun out, they start thinking like, is this going to be, clear that I'm defending my life?
Well, but the thing you have to be careful of is you don't want officers to be so paranoid that they don't react. because that can be just as deadly as overreacting, which is why I said that everyone needs to be at the table as these reforms are being made, because, I don't think anyone would disagree that we can't have people being choked out like we saw with Mr. Floyd. That's nonsense. And that's why I think it's so important that you have to look at the trends and patterns and all the other things. What's the latest in terms of training? But what are officers seeing on the street on a regular basis? There's just a lot to changing training and policy. Now, the obvious, there's no reason for, a guy to be getting choked out and you have a host of other alternatives. That's crazy. And I think everybody would agree. But when we start talking about weaponry and all kinds of other things, those things have to be managed properly. When you are in a riot situation, there's a ton of things that should occur before you go to tear gas and rubber bullets. Something as simple as talking to the organizer of the rally and just saying, hey, look, okay, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? Where is it that you'd like to be? And you kind of work through some things before things happen. And you sort of have a group of people on both sides of that issue, talking about from law enforcement and the protesters, who are helping to police the situation, as you start to see with the rioters. So I say all that to say that while I understood what Ryan was saying, he was making some incredible points, don't get me wrong. But I just think that we have to make sure that you don't go to the point where now officers are afraid to react, and they're there to protect the Smith family, but the officer was just a little bit hesitant about taking a certain action, and then it turns out the Smith family was injured because the officer didn't act in the appropriate manner.
Yeah. I guess, that's the point, too. Man, when you bring up rubber bullets, that makes me think of other things, too. They talk about that like it makes you think somebody's shooting you with a jack ball.
No, not at all.
Yeah, those rubber bullets, they mean like a think lacrosse ball.
Right. It's coming out. Ball. That's right.
Yeah. And I saw some horrifying pictures of protesters and people been shot in the head, with those things. It was like a third eyeball on their head.
Right.
Like, good God. I think people, when they say rubber bullets, people go, oh, okay, it's just rubber bullets. They're just shooting rubber bullets in bean bags. And people think of the little toss across game that there used to be with the little teeny bean bag. But, a bean bag coming at you at about 150 miles an hour might as well be a bullet. I mean, with the exception that it's not penetrating you, but you got a bruise that's going to last there that's going to leave a mark. Same thing with the rubber bullets. When you talk about what made me think about it when you said there's a whole lot of things that you could use before you get to the tear gas.
That's correct.
And that kind of thing. And how ridiculous to use tear gas in the midst of a pandemic, where airborne, fluids and bodily fluids are how the thing is transmitted. So you shoot something in the air that causes people who aren't sneezing and snotting and coughing to sneeze and snot and cough on top of the people who are already sneezing and snotting and coughing. I know. I hope everybody's eating their dinner already. I'm not messing up their food, but the other piece is just all of this stuff happening all at the same time. It seems like is it any different than it's been, or is it the fact that everything now is just kind of being uncovered, or people have their eyes peeled? I mean, it seems like every week there is something. And every week that something has something to do with race on some level. Here, with Bubba Wallace and everything that's going on there with NASCAR, with the noose and all of this kind of stuff. I mean,
sure.
What are we getting at here? What are we what are we trying to? I mean, where do you go next? How do you cover all these bases at one time? I mean, the underlying piece is, race, of course, but everywhere you turn, there is something else going down, and it just doesn't seem that there's anything, any way to stop it in sight. Now, Bubba Wallace caused folks who really never paid attention to NASCAR to pay attention to NASCAR. They're like, "Oh, you got a black driver. Wait a minute." The last one they remember is, and I know there've been many, but everybody remembers Grease Lightning with Wendell Scott and Richard Pryor played.
That's right. That's right.
That's the last driver. But here, Bubba is Bubba's looking strong out there. I don't
That's
know
right.
how he's driving, but Bubba don't take no mess. Bubba don't take no mess. Bubba don't take no mess.
Same.
Bubba don't take no mess.
Same.
That's right.
Yeah, same.
But Chief,
Yes,
what
sir.
are we gonna do, man? I mean, what are the protests still happening? Where's Phil? Phil, we need you to come on here and answer some of these questions now. You have the answers.
Oh yeah,
Phil is like the Shell answer man. He comes every week. He might come in after the break, but he's gonna come on and tell us.
That's right. He's gonna preach.
Listen to Phil.
That's right.
I know you're listening, Phil.
Yeah, he's gonna preach. You know that.
Preach and he's gonna put it out there. And Phil, I'm at a loss, and that's rare. I always have something to say, but now I find myself just scrambling to say something.
Well, this has almost been the perfect storm, if you will, if I can use that term, because you've had the unfortunate and tragic death of Mr. Floyd, and then here we go again with the other death that we just celebrated, and not celebrated, but we celebrated that young man's life, and so people are just like, okay, wait a minute. People are dying over some really ridiculous things here. Fake $20 bill, allegedly, selling a single cigarette, a DUI incident. And of course,
Brother Brooks, that's what it was.
Yeah. And of course they're still gathering information down in Georgia with Mr. Brooks's case, of course. Mm-hmm. But again, people are saying, well, these are not bank robbers that you were dealing with, or just some really horrific folks who were out to do some really bad things, like the young man that shot up Mother Emanuel Church, and you see how he was treated. And ideally, I know many people, well, they're going to shut up what? But ideally, that's the way you want to treat a suspect. You want to treat them, because here's the thing, Thin Bad, that I've neglected to mention. When a detective, trooper, officer has a suspect in custody, whether I've got you sitting in my cruiser on the side of the road and we're waiting for the tow truck, whether I have, just arrested a rape suspect, whether whether I'm talking to the victim of domestic violence, when that person is in the custody of the officer, he or she is duty bound to protect them. That's why an officer should, for example, pull a car over in the safest place possible, because once you pull that person over, you sort of assume responsibility for their safety, right, within reason. If you are giving your field sobriety test on the side of the road, you've moved that particular person out of the road to the safest place out on the road, and you're doing things safely, and then they decide to run out onto the road. Well, up to that point, the officer has done all they can do to safely conduct that test. Or when you transport that person back to headquarters, you have to make sure that they are not beaten up in the cell. Or when they go to DOC has to make sure that, they're okay.